In 1095 CE, in a crowded council in Clermont, Pope Urban II raised his voice and called Europe to arms. His speech ignited what would become the First Crusade. Thousands of knights, peasants, nobles, and adventurers marched east under the banner of the cross. For them, it was a holy mission. For the lands they were heading toward, it would become a storm. By 1099 CE, that storm reached Jerusalem. After weeks of siege, the Crusader armies breached the walls of the sacred city. What followed was not simply conquest, it was massacre. Chroniclers of the time described streets running red. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was established, and for the first time in centuries, the Holy City was under European Christian control. But the tragedy of 1099 CE was not only about Crusader strength, it was also about Muslim weakness. Baghdad still had an Abbasid caliph, but he held little political authority. Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia power separate from the Sunni world. Syria was divided among Seljuk princes competing with each other more than with their external enemies. The Muslim world was not defeated because it was weak. It was defeated because it was divided. And history was quietly preparing a man who would change that. In 1137 or 1138 CE, in the city of Tikrit along the Tigris River, a child was born into a Kurdish family. His name was Saladin. On the very night of his birth, fate seemed to signal that his life would not be ordinary. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, and his uncle Shirkuh were forced to leave Tikrit due to political tensions. The family departed under the cover of darkness, carrying the newborn child with them. They settled first in Mosul, then later in Damascus, a city alive with scholars, soldiers, traders, and political ambition. During the 1140s, while Crusader states were consolidating power in the Levant, young Saladin was not training on the battlefield. Instead, he studied Quranic sciences, Islamic law, Arabic literature, mathematics, and administration. He grew into a thoughtful, disciplined young man, reserved rather than reckless. Damascus in 1146 CE was under the rule of a rising Muslim leader who would deeply influence Saladin's future, Nur ad-Din Zengi. Saladin observed a ruler who combined faith with politics and strategy. He saw a leader who believed unity was the only answer to Crusader power. At this stage, in the 1140s, no one could imagine that this quiet student would one day fulfill that vision. But history often chooses unlikely beginnings. By 1146 CE, Nur ad-Din Zengi had become one of the most powerful Muslim rulers in Syria. After avenging his father's death and consolidating Aleppo and Damascus, he positioned himself as the champion of Sunni Islam against Crusader states. Young Saladin entered Nur ad-Din's service during the 1150s. At first, he was not a central military commander. He learned administration, court politics, logistics, and strategy. He watched how Nur ad-Din balanced religion with governance and warfare with diplomacy. During these years, especially between 1150 and 1164 CE, the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem remained powerful. Coastal fortresses stood strong. Trade flowed through Mediterranean ports. Muslim lands were still politically fractured, but Nur ad-Din understood something critical in the early 1160s. Egypt was the key. If Egypt remained weak under the Fatimids, the Crusaders could eventually control it. If Egypt fell to the Crusaders, Syria would be surrounded. So in 1164 CE, when Egypt descended into political chaos, Nur ad-Din sent an army south, led by Shirkuh. Saladin went with him, and this decision would transform everything. Between 1164 and 1169 CE, Egypt became the battlefield of diplomacy, betrayal, and shifting alliances. The Fatimid Caliphate was crumbling. Viziers were assassinated. Crusader forces attempted to intervene. Egypt stood vulnerable. Shirkuh fought multiple campaigns in Cairo. Saladin observed, learned, and slowly gained trust among soldiers and administrators. Then in January 1169 CE, Shirkuh died unexpectedly. In a shocking turn of events, the Fatimid Caliph appointed Saladin as Vizier of Egypt. A Sunni officer, loyal to Nur ad-Din, now ruled in the heart of a Shia Fatimid state. At only around 30 years of age, Saladin held immense responsibility. Between 1169 and 1171 CE, he carefully restructured Egypt's military and financial systems. He placed trusted commanders in key positions. He strengthened ties with Sunni scholars. Then in 1171 CE, something historic happened. The Fatimid Caliph died. Saladin did not appoint a successor. Instead, during Friday prayer, the khutbah was read in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. The Fatimid Caliphate, which had ruled Egypt for over 2 centuries, quietly ended. The Ayyubid era had begun. In 1174 CE, destiny accelerated. Nur ad-Din Zengi died suddenly in May 1174 CE. His young son inherited Syria, but real power fragmented among rival leaders. Saladin, ruling Egypt since 1169 CE, understood the danger. If Syria fractured further, Crusaders would exploit the division. So in late 1174 CE, Saladin marched north from Egypt toward Damascus. The city welcomed him peacefully. Over the next several years, between 1174 and 1186 CE, Saladin expanded carefully. Some cities surrendered voluntarily. Others required military pressure. Aleppo resisted until 1183 CE. Mosul acknowledged his authority later. This was not reckless conquest. It was strategic unification. By the mid-1180s, Egypt, Syria, parts of Iraq, and Yemen recognized Ayyubid authority. For the first time since the Crusaders arrived in 1099 CE, the Muslim Near East was largely united under one leadership. And now, Saladin could turn fully toward Jerusalem. By 1186 CE, nearly 12 years had passed since Saladin entered Damascus in 1174. Egypt and Syria were united. Armies were reorganized. Fortresses strengthened. The Ayyubid state was stable. But peace with the Crusaders was fragile. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, established in 1099 CE, still controlled the Holy City and major coastal fortresses. Tension constantly simmered along the borders. Then came the spark. In late 1186 CE, Reynald of Chatillon, a reckless Crusader lord, attacked Muslim trade caravans traveling between Damascus and Mecca. These caravans were under truce protection. Pilgrims were harmed. Wealth was seized. Saladin demanded justice. The Crusader king, Guy of Lusignan, hesitated. Reynald refused to apologize. For Saladin, this was no longer about politics. It was about honor, law, and protection of sacred routes. Throughout early 1187 CE, Saladin moved carefully. He gathered forces from Egypt, Syria, Mosul, and Jazeera. Tribal cavalry joined. Volunteers arrived under the banner of jihad, not as chaotic mobs, but as organized regiments. In June 1187 CE, Saladin executed a strategic plan. He attacked Tiberias, forcing the Crusader army to march across dry land under the summer sun. He did not rush. He waited. And by early July 1187 CE, 2 armies stood near the volcanic hills of Hattin. History was about to turn. On July 4th, 1187 CE, under a burning sun near the horns of Hattin, the Crusader army found itself trapped. Saladin had controlled the water sources. The Crusaders, marching from Sepphoris toward Tiberias in the July heat, were exhausted and dehydrated. Smoke from burning dry grass filled the air as Ayyubid forces tightened the circle. This was not chaos. It was strategy. Saladin's cavalry units attacked in waves, retreating and striking again. Archers weakened enemy lines. the Crusader formation slowly collapsed. By afternoon, the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army, the same kingdom born in blood in 1099 CE, was shattered. King Guy of Lusignan was captured. Raynald of Chatillon was brought before Saladin. Chroniclers record that Saladin offered water to the captured king, a gesture of mercy. When Raynald drank, Saladin reminded him that he himself had not offered protection to the man who broke sacred treaties. Raynald was executed. It was symbolic. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 CE destroyed Crusader military dominance in the region. Fortress after fortress fell in the following months. The road to Jerusalem was open. 90 years after its fall in 1099 CE, Jerusalem stood vulnerable. By September 1187 CE, Saladin's forces surrounded the city. Inside, fear spread. The defenders remembered the massacre committed by Crusaders in 1099, and they feared revenge. But Saladin did not come seeking blood. After negotiations with Balian of Ibelin, Jerusalem surrendered peacefully on October 2nd, 1187 CE. There was no massacre. Christian civilians were allowed to ransom themselves. Many were freed. Churches were respected. Holy sites were protected. When Saladin entered Jerusalem in 1187 CE, he walked humbly, not as a conqueror intoxicated by victory, but as a ruler aware of history. The Dome of the Rock was cleansed and restored for Islamic worship. The call to prayer echoed once again after nearly 9 decades. The fall of Jerusalem shocked Europe, and Europe would respond. By 1189 CE, Europe mobilized again. This time, kings came personally. Among them was Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart. Also arriving was Philip II of France. The Third Crusade began. Between 1189 and 1191 CE, intense battles were fought along the Mediterranean coast. Acre fell to Crusader forces in 1191. Prisoners were executed by both sides in brutal exchanges. Richard proved to be a formidable commander. In the Battle of Arsuf, September 1191 CE, Crusader forces managed to push back Ayyubid troops in open combat. Yet despite Richard's skill, Jerusalem remained beyond reach. Why? Because Saladin avoided reckless confrontation. He weakened supply lines. He controlled inland territories. He understood that defending Jerusalem meant preserving strength, not chasing glory. By September 1192 CE, after years of exhausting warfare, both sides agreed to the Treaty of Ramla. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims would be allowed safe access. Neither side had achieved total victory, but the Ayyubid state survived intact. In early 1193 CE, in Damascus, the man who had reshaped the Middle East fell ill. On March 4th, 1193 CE, Saladin died. He was only in his mid-50s. Despite ruling vast territories from Egypt to northern Iraq, he left behind very little personal wealth. Most of his treasury had been spent on war, charity, and governance. But his greatest achievement was not land. It was unity. From the fractured chaos of 1099 CE, he had built a centralized Sunni power that restored balance to the region. Yet empires often weaken after strong rulers die. And the Ayyubid story was not finished. After 1193 CE, Saladin's empire was divided among his sons and relatives. Egypt went to Al-Aziz, Damascus to Al-Athal, Aleppo and other regions to different family members. Between 1193 and 1200 CE, rivalries weakened central authority. Brothers competed. Nephews challenged uncles. Yet the Ayyubid structure did not collapse immediately. In 1218 CE, during the Fifth Crusade, European forces attacked Damietta in Egypt. The Ayyubids defended fiercely. After years of struggle, by 1221 CE, Crusader forces withdrew. In 1229 CE, however, diplomacy took a surprising turn. Through negotiations between Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, Jerusalem was temporarily handed over peacefully. This was not defeat by battle, but by treaty. Yet the city would later return to Muslim control. The Ayyubids were adapting, negotiating, surviving. Between 1200 and 1250 CE, the Ayyubid state invested in fortifications, education, and military reform. The citadel of Cairo was strengthened. Madrasas were established in Damascus and Jerusalem. Sunni scholarship flourished. But perhaps the most important development was military. The Ayyubids increasingly relied on elite slave soldiers known as Mamluks. These warriors were highly trained, loyal to their commanders, and politically ambitious. By the 1240s, Mamluks had become extremely powerful within the Egyptian military structure. Meanwhile, new threats emerged, including Mongol expansion in the east. In 1250 CE, after internal conflict in Egypt, the Mamluks overthrew the last Ayyubid ruler in Cairo. The Saltanat-e-Ayubia officially ended, but its legacy did not. The Mamluks, who would later defeat the Mongols in 1260 CE, inherited the military foundations built by the Ayyubids. From the tragedy of 1099 CE to the transformation of 1250 CE, the Ayyubid Sultanate reshaped the Middle East. It restored Jerusalem in 1187 CE. It united Egypt and Syria in 1174 to 1186 CE. It resisted Europe's greatest kings in 1189 to 1192 CE. It laid the foundation for the Mamluk power that would defend the region against Mongol invasion. Saltanat-e-Ayubia was not just a dynasty. It was a bridge between division and unity, between Crusader dominance and Muslim resurgence. And at its heart stood a man who began life in exile in 1137 CE and died in 1193 CE as one of history's most respected rulers. That is the story of the Ayyubid Sultanate.